Welcome back to Inside Africa. Somalia is the scene of what has been called the worst humanitarian crisis in Africa. Now, the UN says it's about to get worse. Escalating violence and a global food crisis have combined to put much of the country on the brink of famine. Our partner network ITN recently sent a videographer to a clinic for malnourished children on the edge of Mogadishu. John Sparks filed this report using those images, and we must warn you, some viewers may find them distressing.
Just a few minutes past 8 at the clinic in Afgoya. It hasn't been open for long, but it's already full. Hundreds of young children and their anxious parents jostle for space and clamour for treatment. There are 80 beds here for the severely malnourished. Every one has an occupant. Dazed and immobile, these children are the product of prolonged starvation. Their condition worsened by fever, diarrhea and dysentery. This is Somalia, war-torn, ungovernable and on the edge.
The situation in Somalia today is verging on the catastrophic. During the last 3 to 4 weeks, we have seen a 200% increase in the number of children admitted to our nutrition projects. And these children are coming from further and further away.
More than 1,000 children now journey to this modest facility every week, their diet supplemented with a high-protein peanut paste. There are only a handful of clinics to do the job, though, and their responsibilities are growing.
There is a perfect storm building. We're talking about the increases in the prices of the basic food commodities, some of which have increased by 150 to 200%, partly brought on because of the drought that is being experienced in certain parts of the country at the moment. And on top of that, we have a deteriorating security situation.
For 15 years, Somalia was a battleground populated by powerful warlords, yet the worst fighting has come in the last 24 months. An Islamic regime was overthrown by neighbouring Ethiopia with American support. A bloody civil war rages, largely on the streets of Mogadishu. Residents now call it Baghdad on sea, but there aren't many left. Some 700,000 have fled for their lives. While torn from within, Somalia is not immune from global pressures. Rising food prices brought people out onto the streets last week. The main staples, if available, are out of reach for many now. 5 were killed in the ensuing riots. The man charged by the international community to bring stability to Somalia, the nominal president, Abdullahi Yusuf, was in Paris, and he seemed far removed.
You had riots this morning in your country. 2 people were killed because of the famine.
What happened today in Somalia?
You had some.
I don't know what happened today.
You had some riots.
Well, this is what's happening. We've obtained this UN analysis. Over the last 3 months, a huge swathe of the country turns red, designating a humanitarian emergency. 2.5 million people now at risk of starvation. A country close to famine. A clinic trying to cope. Images like these triggered a massive US-backed response 16 years ago. But that was then. This time Somalia is on its own.
That was ITN's John Sparks reporting. The situation in Somalia is obviously dire. So what, if anything, can be done to turn it around? I asked Colin Thomas Jensen, a policy advisor with the Enough Project, about peace talks that have been going on in Djibouti.
This is the United Nations new Special Representative, Mr. Ould Abdallah, Ambassador Ould Abdallah's first attempt at some sort of a mediation and a dialogue. And I think the parties are at this point waiting to see what's going to shake out on each side very early. The opposition right now is a mix. It's a mix of, on the one hand, disaffected clans, those Somali clans who've been excluded from the TFG, and on the other hand, the Islamist opposition. The makeup of the Islamic courts, which briefly held control of southern Somalia, as well as militias and clans that joined their struggle. You have to deal with multiple factions with varying degrees of power, and quite often there's no obvious leader to deal with.
In the last couple of weeks, we've seen dreadful scenes emerge from Somalia of widespread bloodshed, and we're also hearing reports that Ethiopian troops have, in their way, played their part in perpetrating crimes. What are you hearing about Ethiopia's part in this?
Well, all parties to this conflict are guilty of crimes against humanity, and what we've seen from the Ethiopians is widespread human rights abuses, including the indiscriminate bombings of neighborhoods in Mogadishu. And it's these policies that I think are contributing to, one, a massive humanitarian crisis in the country, and two, a rising and growing opposition against the Ethiopian occupation that could ultimately lead to some even more serious fighting across the country.
When you look at this and you put it in context that Ethiopia and Somalia have long had a troubled relationship, why do you think they're involved in this conflict?
Yeah, Ethiopia and Somalia are traditional enemies. And in this case, Ethiopia saw the rise of the Islamic courts, the irredentist claims that they were making on annexing parts of Ethiopia that are inhabited by ethnic Somalis as a threat, as well as the threat of terrorism that could emanate from an Islamist government. And so Ethiopia, acting on its own, but with support from the U.S. and others, invaded Somalia to prop up a proxy government, the TFG, Transitional Federal Government. We're unlikely to see a change in the Ethiopian support for the TFG in the near future, largely because the U.S., which is a huge player and has tremendous influence with Ethiopia, is not going to change its position in this administration.
Thomas Jensen says many Somalis consider the transitional federal government illegitimate. We turn now to a stunning first for Khartoum. When Inside Africa continues, rebels from Darfur reached the edge of the Sudanese capital. And still ahead, the U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe has a run-in with Zimbabwean police during a fact-finding tour.